Alrighty, yeah, let's go ahead and get things kicked off. So first off, as usual, thanks everyone for coming to hang out with us on this my afternoon. Mark, I think it's your Tuesday evening, and I think the people in the chat, it's Wednesday, Tuesday, or Monday. It's one of those 3 days somewhere. This is part of our bi-weekly webinar, where we like to dive deep on usually an open source concept within Airflow. So today, I have with me the man who needs no introduction, Mark, the Airflow guru, as far as I'm concerned, on all social media, going to talk about scheduling DAGs with some of the new features out there. So, that being said, Mark, take it away.
Thank you, Rivaj. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome everyone. I'm super excited to see you in this webinar. I mean, it's been a long time actually. And in this webinar, you're going to learn how to schedule your DAGs like never before. And I know that this is a bold statement, but trust me, what you're going to discover will really blow your mind. I mean, now that Airflow 2.2 is out, there is a new feature that just came out as well. And that one, my gosh, you really want to see that. But before, I'm going to start with the basics, like how DAG scheduling works, because I'm pretty sure that, I mean, we all have started with Airflow and we were like, how our DAGs are scheduled, it doesn't make any sense, maybe. So we're going to start with the basics, then we will see some more advanced concepts about DAG scheduling, and then you will discover the most important new feature, in my opinion, of Airflow 2.2, and I'm super excited about this. So if you are ready, let's get started. So first, the basics, right? There are three concepts that you need to know whenever you get started with Airflow. And well, if you are not new with Airflow, then that will be just a good reminder for you. And if you are new to Airflow, then you will definitely enjoy this slide. So the first concept that you absolutely need to know is the concept of start date. So a start date is nothing more than a datetime object that defines the date at which your DAG starts being scheduled, or all of your tasks start being scheduled. The start date must be defined within your DAG object. Okay, you have to define a start date in your DAG, otherwise you will get an error. Also, one important thing to notice is that if you define your start date, for example, 1 year ago, okay, so a long time ago, and you trigger your DAG right now, okay, you start scheduling your DAG right now, you will end up with a lot of DAG runs running at the same time, because by default, Airflow will try to run all the non-triggered DAG runs between the current date time and the start date. And this is controlled by the catcher parameter. So as a best practice, always set the catcher parameter to false. Okay, and whenever you need to backfill your DAG, whenever you need to run non-triggered DAG runs, or even already triggered DAG runs, you can use the Airflow backfill command from the Airflow CLI. So don't hesitate to do that. But my point is, it's always better to have like the full control over your DAG. Then last but not least, there is something else that you need to know with the start date, is that I'm pretty sure that in many examples, you've seen that the start date defined dynamically, with like .now maybe. Well, don't do that. Why? Because in theory, that shouldn't work. Because as you're going to see later, the way your DAGs are scheduled, that shouldn't work. So as a best practice, and this is the second best practice is for the start date, always specify a static start date. Always do that. Now, the second concept that you need to know is the schedule interval. Basically, the schedule interval is nothing more than the frequency, the interval of time at which your DAG gets triggered. For example, daily, like every day at midnight, or maybe monthly, or maybe weekly. The point is, the schedule interval defines the frequency at which your DAG gets triggered. And then there is the end date. And the end date is the date at which your DAG will stop being scheduled. Okay, maybe you want to trigger your DAG, let's say during 2 weeks, and then you just want to stop scheduling your DAG. Well, you can do that by defining an end date. And this expects a datetime object. And by the way, for the schedule interval, you can define it in two different ways, either by using a cron expression or by using a time delta object. And you're going to see the difference between those two. So that's the most important concepts for DAG scheduling: start date, schedule interval, end date. And now there is this sentence that sums up how your DAGs are scheduled in Airflow. Basically, you can say that your DAG starts being scheduled from the start date, let's say the 1st of January 2021, and will be triggered after every scheduled interval. For example, every day or every 10 minutes. It's truly important to remember that because this is the most confusing part, actually. Your DAG gets triggered after the start date plus the scheduled interval. So for example, if you run your DAG the 1st of January 2021, and then you set a scheduled interval to daily, that means your DAG will get effectively triggered the 2nd of January 2021. But let's show you this. So let's say that you have a DAG with a start date at 10 a.m. and your scheduled interval is set to every 10 minutes. Okay, pretty simple. What will happen? Well, first, your start date, your first DAG run, nothing happens yet. Okay, it is at 10 a.m., nothing happens. Airflow waits 10 minutes, and then at 10 and 10 a.m., your first DAG run gets triggered. Okay, so again, Airflow waits 10 minutes, the scheduled interval, and then your first DAG run gets triggered. And then this DAG run will get an execution date that corresponds to the beginning of the period of time. So in that case, 10 a.m. This is a new concept to understand, the concept of execution date. Each time a DAG run is triggered, okay, for each DAG run, you have an execution date. And that execution date corresponds to the beginning of the period of time covered by your DAG. Right? Execution date. Now what happens next? Well, once your DAG run is completed, you have the second DAG run. And so in that case, again, Airflow will wait 10 minutes from 10 and 10 a.m. And then the second DAG run will get triggered at 10:20 a.m. And the execution date for the second DAG run will be equal to 10 and 10 a.m. All right? That's how it works. Same thing for the third DAG run. Again, at 10:20, Airflow will wait 10 minutes, and then at 10:30 a.m., your third DAG run gets triggered, and the execution date for that DAG run is equal to 10:20 a.m. Right? Now, this is confusing. I mean, let's face it, the execution date doesn't mean, it's not really meaningful, right? Because the execution date is not really the date at which your DAG is triggered, right? Is executed, but it corresponds to the beginning of the period of time that your DAG covers. For example, here, your first DAG run is triggered at 10 and 10 a.m., but the execution date for that DAG run is equal to 10 a.m. So that was so confusing. But now it's over. Because there are some new concepts that have been introduced with Airflow 2.2. And the first one is the data interval start. So what is the data interval start? Well, it's nothing more than the start date of the data interval covered by your DAG, and so the execution date. Okay, so you have this concept of data intervals, and you have a data interval start and a data interval end that corresponds to the end date of your data interval. Pretty simple. And then you have the logical date, which is actually the new name of the execution date. Because the execution date, again, not really meaningful. So now, as you're going to see in the next versions of Airflow, you won't see the execution date again. Instead, you will see the logical date. But what you have to remember now is that the mechanism, the way your DAGs are scheduled, stay the same, but just some words are changing. So basically, the data interval start equals to the logical date, that equals to the execution date. So if we take the previous example, it is as simple as that. No worries, it's really simple. Actually, now you have your first DAG run, and your first DAG run will have a data interval start and a data interval end. So the data interval start of your first DAG run will be at 10 a.m. and the data interval end will be at 10 and 10 a.m. And again, like before, your DAG is triggered at 10 and 10 a.m. At 10 and 10 a.m. Okay? right? You have data intervals. Your second diagram, for example, we have the data interval start at 10 and 10 a.m. and the data interval end will be at 10:20 a.m. And the old execution date, right, is actually the data interval start. But now it makes sense, right? Because data interval start doesn't mean your DAG gets triggered at that time. So this is much cleaner, much clearer than before. And that's the new concepts that have been introduced in Airflow 2.2. Now, along with those concepts, well, this is a bit off topic, but still very important to know. There is a good chance that in your DAGs, you are using templates, right? Where you inject data at runtime. And maybe you use the macro, the variable actually, execution underscore date. Well, this one is deprecated. Instead, you should use data interval start to reference your execution date, or data interval end to know the end of your data interval. Then you have DS, which is still not deprecated, so you can still use it, and actually it corresponds to the execution date, and so the data interval start. And then you have three other variables that I like a lot, which are prev data interval start success, prev data interval end success, and prev start date success. Why those variables are truly useful for you? You know, this is just like something else, but I think it's important for you. I mean, you will love that. There is a good chance that you have already wondered, how can I make sure that, well, if my previous diagram didn't succeed, then I don't want to trigger my current diagram, or I don't want to trigger my next diagram. How can I do that? Well, with prev data interval start success, you can use that one in a branch operator as your first task and say, okay, if the prev data interval start success is equal to none, or actually is equal to a date that doesn't correspond to my previous diagram, then that means the previous diagram didn't succeed, and so I shouldn't trigger my current diagram. Okay? So this is a way to, you know, make sure that your diagram gets triggered only if the previous one has succeeded. Truly useful. It's a bit off topic, but truly useful. And no, you can't not use, and no, you cannot use depends on past. But this is another topic. Also, by default, you have to know that behind the scene, all of your dates are converted in UTC. And I strongly advise you to stick with UTC, okay? Don't mess up with time zones. You're gonna end up in a real nightmare. Maybe you will even quit your job because of time zones, okay? You don't want to mess up with time zones. In my opinion, as a best practice, always use all of your dates in UTC. Okay, there is a bit of like, you have to figure out what is the correct start date, for example, to define according to the UTC time zone, but in my opinion, always use UTC. And behind the scene, again, everything is converted in UTC. Okay, that's the basics. Now it's time to move to the more advanced concepts, or maybe some old untold concepts. Okay, let's see that. Well, the first thing to note, and this is a question actually I have for you. What is the difference between this, so defining the start date within your default arguments, and this? Because I'm pretty sure that you have already seen that. So what is the difference between defining your start date in the default args and defining your start date in the DAG object? What is the difference? Well, before answering that question, there is something else that you need to know. This right there is possible. And maybe you don't know what I'm talking about, but if you carefully take a look at each task, you can see that each task has a different start date. Extract has a start date the 1st of January 2021, then process the 2nd of January 2021, and the last one is the 3rd of January 2021. Oh my gosh, how is that possible? What does it mean? Well, one thing to note, and one thing that you need to know, is that you can define a start date at the task level. Are you gonna do that? I don't think so. I've never seen that in my my entire Airflow experience. Never. But still, you have to know that it is possible. And what will happen if you do that is that the first diagram, well, actually, that's a good question for you. Can you tell me in the chat right now, what will be the date of the first diagram if you do that? Can you tell me in the chat what will be the date of the first diagram for that diag? Let's wait a little bit. Try to guess either the 1st of January 2021, the 2nd or the 3rd. Can you guess? Okay, we got a few answers. All right. All right. Okay, that's interesting. One of these. Yeah, that's true. Okay, so actually, one thing you need to know is that the minimum start date will be taken by the scheduler to trigger your first diagram. So in that case, your first diagram will have the date the 1st of January 2021. Okay. Now, let's get back to the previous question. What is the difference between those two? Well, keep in mind that whenever you define something in the default arguments, this will be applied to all of your tasks. So in that case, you are defining the start date, the same start date for all of your tasks. So here, the 1st of January 2021. Now, if you define the start date in the default args and the same start date in the DAG object, Airflow will always take the start date in the DAG object. It will always do that. So that's the first thing. Now, what happens if you define a start date in the default arguments, that it is different than the start date defined in the DAG object? Well, in that case, Airflow will take the maximum, the latest start date between the two. So for example, if you set the 1st of January 2021 in the default arguments, and then in your DAG object, you also define the, let's say, the 2nd of January 2021, then in that case, Airflow will take the 2nd of January 2021 for the date of your first diagram. All right. So as a best practice, and actually you will see that in the new Airflow DAG examples, always define the start date within your DAG object. There is no point at all, unless you want to have different start dates for your tasks, but there is no point at all to define your start date within the default arguments. I did that. I'm pretty sure that we all did that, but now you can just define your start date within your DAG object. Do that. It's much clearer, in my opinion. Okay? Right. Now, as you know, maybe the schedule interval can be defined in two different ways, either by using a cron expression or by using a time delta object. But again, what is the difference between those two ways of defining your schedule intervals? Well, it's time for a fight. Let me give you an example. Let's say you want to trigger your DAG every 3 days. Okay, so you have like November and December, so you can express that in your cron expression. You can say, I want to trigger my DAG on the 25th, then on the 28th, then on the 1st of, then maybe on the 31st of the month, and on the 1st of the month. Okay, you can define this in your cron expression. And so you will end up with something like this. So everything is good here. But now what happens if you have this time, the 31st? Okay, here you have like 30 days, but now you have 31 days. Well, in that case, if you use the same cron expression, you will end up with this. So 25th, 28th, sorry, it's hard for me to say that. And then you will end up with the 31 and the 1st. So as you can see here, you are not respecting anymore the 3 days interval. Okay, and that's where the time delta object comes in. With a time delta object, if you define that time delta object to 3 days, you will always skip the 3 days. You will always keep the interval of time of 3 days between each DAG run, right? So what you have to remember is that the cron expression is stateless and the time delta object is like stateful, which means it cares of what happened earlier, before. Okay, so this is a concrete example of why you need a time delta object. Now, another example, and this one might be a bit tricky: daylight saving time. In Europe and in some other countries, there is, this time, I think twice in a year, where you either move forward or we move backward, depending on if we are on spring or on fall. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that if you use a cron expression, then the DST time will be restricted. So, for example, if your DAG used to be triggered at let's say 4 p.m., for example, and then we move forward, so 1 hour 1 hour forward, then your DAG will get triggered at 5 p.m. Same thing if we move backward. Now, if you use a time delta object, then in that case, it doesn't care. Okay, it doesn't care about DST. So keep in mind this, and this is valid only if you set a local time zone for your DAG, but it's good to know that, right? It's a bit tricky, time zones again. All right, I think it's time to move to famous feature, my favorite one. I really love that one. You're gonna love it too. But first, let me give you some very concrete use cases of why this feature is gonna be super important for you. What if you have this DAG, this scheduling interval? For example, you want to trigger your DAG on Monday between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. And then you want to run it on Wednesday, but this time you want to run it between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. How can you do that? Well, you can't. Now, what if you have this scheduling interval? For example, here, you want to trigger your DAG on Monday, right? 2 p.m., 4 p.m., but you have some holidays. And maybe your DAG runs daily. So how do you make sure that you can skip those holidays? How can you make sure that you take care of those holidays? And again, maybe you want to trigger your DAG on Thursday, but this time between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. And last but not least, what if you want to trigger your DAG within the same day, but on different times? For example, maybe you want to trigger it on Monday between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. and then between 9 p.m. and 10 p.m. Maybe you need to deal with stock market data. Well, in that case, you may want to trigger your DAG at the open of the stock market, and then you want to trigger your DAG at the end of your stock market. And actually, the stock market is really, really a hard example, but a nice example for this feature. So how can you solve those use cases that we all wanted to solve at least once in our Airflow journey? Well, this is where this feature, the best one, timetables. Timetables are great. Now you have all the flexibility, all the power that you ever dreamed of for scheduling your DAGs. Okay, you're an engineer, you're a data engineer, maybe you're a data scientist, whatever, but the point is, now you have all the flexibility, the freedom that you ever dreamed of for controlling your scheduling interval. It's really awesome. So think of a timetable as an interface defining the way your DAG is going to be scheduled. It is as simple as that, but it's a new concept. And there are 4 steps to implement your timetable. The first one is define your constraints. For example, maybe you want to trigger your DAG only during weekdays. Or maybe you want to say, okay, if my DAG gets triggered manually on Sunday, I want to shift it to the next Monday or to the last Friday. The point is, you have to define the constraints. You have to define the way you want to schedule your DAGs. And then the second step is to register your timetable as a plugin. Yes. This is the first thing that you need to know with timetables. A timetable is a plugin. It is a plugin. So you're gonna create, if you remember, starting from Airflow 2.0, you don't have to create a plugin for adding new operators like before, right? You just need to create a new class that inherits from an operator or the base operator, and then you can create your own operator and call it from your DAGs. But with the timetable, you have to do it like the old way, or actually with the Airflow plugin class. Like you will have to do it if you want to change the views of your Airflow instance. But let me show you this concretely. So let's imagine that your goal is to, and for this example, I'm going to take the example that you can find from the Airflow documentation, because I truly believe that this one is actually really well made and easy to understand. But I'm going to show you other examples that are definitely more complex. But let's start simple, right? So let's imagine that you have this DAG that you want to trigger during weekdays only, and not during weekends. Maybe you express that with the cron expression, like 3 stars and I think it was 1-5, something like that. But the point is, if you try to do that with the cron expression, well, the DAG run on Friday will get triggered on Monday. Okay, and you don't want to wait Monday to get the data of Friday. Okay, so again, if you try to do that with the cron expression, the DAG run that should be triggered on Friday will be effectively triggered on Monday. And so you will have to wait on the next Monday to get your data for Friday. So let's see how to do it. The first step is to, in the folder plugins, you have to do that in the folder plugins because it is a plugin. You create a new file and let's call it weekday time. Okay. So once you have that, you need to define, and this is the first step, you need to register your timetable. So let's do that. So you type from Airflow.plugins. Oops, I can't see what I'm doing here. Okay. From plugins _manager, import Airflow plugin, because you're going to add a new plugin, right? So you need to import the Airflow plugin class. And then the timetable, obviously, as you're going to define a timetable. So you type from Airflow.timetables.base import timetable. Okay, so that's the two classes that you need to import first. Then you need to define a new class, so your plugin in that case, and let's call it Workday timetable and plugin that inherits from the Airflow plugin class. Nothing new here. You need to define a name for that plugin. I mean, it's not really important, but still you have to do it. So let's say Workday _timetable _plugin. And then, and this is important, you need to register your timetables. So here you need to define the you need to use the attribute timetables that it is equal to a list, and here you're going to put your timetable. So in that case, let's say after Workday timetable, and obviously you define your timetable. So class after Workday timetable that inherits from the timetable. That's the first step. Okay, like with the views, whenever you want to modify a view in your Airflow instance, you need to, you need to override the views attribute. Here, you need to override the timetables attribute, and you need to put your timetable or your timetables if you have multiple timetables. Okay. All right. So once you have this, the next step is to implement your timetable. But one thing to remember is that as it is a plugin, you will need to restart the web server and the scheduler to get your modifications taken into account. Okay, I repeat, as it is a plugin that it is used both by the scheduler and the web server, you will need to restart those components if you want to take into account the modifications you made for your timetable. And the second point is if you made a mistake, if you make a mistake, if you made a mistake in your timetable, then maybe you won't be able to see your DAG on the Airflow UI. And so in that case, you will have to take a look at the logs, and I strongly advise you to do that. Take a look at the logs of your DAG take a look at the logs of your scheduler or at the DAG that uses your timetable. Okay, take a look at the logs, because sometimes you may end up with weird behaviors or weird, not meaningful errors, I would say. And so it will be definitely easier for you to debug your error if you take a look at the logs of your scheduler. Okay. Okay. So the timetable is registered. What is the next step? Well, obviously the next step is to create your timetable. And there are two methods that you will always implement. Always, always, always. Let's start by the first one. So the first one is infer data interval that expects one argument, which is run_after. That is a datetime object. And this method returns a data interval object. This method will be called whenever you trigger your DAG manually. So if you trigger your DAG manually, this method will be called. So now the question is, what should you do? What should you do whenever you trigger your DAG manually? Well, in that case, you want to make sure that your DAG, the data interval of your DAG, will be always within weekdays. Okay, so either on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and so on. So the first step could be to create a new variable. Let's call it weekday equals to run_after. And run_after here corresponds to the date at which your DAG gets triggered manually. Okay. Weekday. And then you want to say, okay, if my current weekday is either, let's say between, at least if I trigger my DAG on Monday or on Sunday, then I want to specify that the data interval for that DAG, for that specific DAG run, will be on the last Friday. Okay, so again, you trigger your DAG on Sunday, you want to say, okay, the data interval that should be covered for that DAG run will be last Friday. So here, you're gonna create a new variable, let's say delta, and a time delta object equals to days. And you will need to compute the days since Friday. Okay, so right there, you can create a new variable as well, days since Friday. And then you say, I want the weekday -4 modulo 7 to get the days since Friday. Okay. Now, if you didn't trigger your DAG manually on Monday or on Sunday, then in that case, the only thing you want to do is to set the interval, the start of your interval to yesterday. So you just need to define the delta equals to time delta days equals to 1. Okay, so here what you are doing is that you are going to define the data interval that will be covered by your DAG run. So you need to define the start of your data interval and the end of your data interval. So once you have that, once you have the data, you just need to define the start. So you type start equals to a datetime object, and you combined run_after minus the delta, right? So if you trigger your DAG on Sunday, for example, this time the start of your data interval will be Friday. Then you get the date. And for the time, as you want to run it weekday, let's use midnight. Okay, that's what you are doing with time.me. And the last thing, pretty important, is to always define the time zones. So you want to always define UTC as a time zone. So here you type replace TZ info. So here TZ info equals to UTC. And we can define a UTC right there with UTC equals to time zone UTC. Okay? So now you have defined your start, the data interval start. You are ready to return your data interval. So you type return data interval like that, with the start equals to start, obviously, and then the end equals to, well, the start plus time delta days equals to 1, as you want to cover 1 day. Okay, does it make sense? So again, this method will be called whenever your DAG gets triggered manually, whenever you trigger your DAG manually. Run after is the date at which your DAG is triggered manually. And then this method returns a data interval corresponding to the data interval that you want to cover with your DAG run. And as you want to run your DAG on weekdays, you say, okay, if the weekday is equal to either on Monday or Sunday, then I want to set the data interval, the start of the data interval to last Friday, otherwise to yesterday, right? Okay. Once you have done that, there is the second method that you need to implement, which is, in that case, and this one is more complicated, next DAG run info. And this method expects two arguments. The first one is last underscore automated underscore data underscore interval. That's which is a date interval object, a data interval object. And then you have restriction, which is a time restriction object. And this returns an optional, no worries, I'm going to explain this, an optional DAG run info. Okay, pretty complicated here, but let me tell you exactly what you are doing. So next DAG run info here will be called whenever your DAG is triggered by the scheduler. Okay, so with the first method, this one is called when you trigger your DAG manually. This method is triggered by the scheduler automatically. So whenever your DAG is triggered by the scheduler, this method is called. Then you have two arguments. Last automated data interval that corresponds to the data interval of the previous DAG run, of the last DAG run. And then you have restriction, which is pretty useful because you can get some information about your DAG, such as the catch-up parameter, if it is set to false or true, the start date or earliest in the case of the restriction object, and latest that corresponds to the end date, if any. Okay, so catch-up, earliest, the start date, latest, the end date of your DAG, right? And then you need to return a DAG run info, which is actually just a class that encapsulates a data interval object. So now, once you have that, here there are something that you will always do. You will always check if the last automated data interval is not known. If it is not known, that means, well, you already got some previous DAG runs. Otherwise, it is the first time that you trigger your DAG. And so you need to do something. Let's begin here. So what you will always do is that you will first get your start date. So here, what you want to do is to define the next data interval, the next start of your data interval. So let's create a new variable next start, which is equals to restriction dot earliest. And here earliest is the start date. Okay. And you will always do that again. You will check if the next start is known. If so, then you return known. Why? Because you have to specify a start date in your DAG. And that's exactly what you are doing here. First condition, you will always do that. The next condition is, well, the catch-up parameter. If the catch-up parameter is set to false, what should you do? Well, in that case, you should set the start of your next date interval to today. So either the start date or today, right? Because you don't want to run the past non-triggered diagrams. So how can you do that? Again, you define next start, which is equals to max. And here, either the start date, okay, remember that this is actually the start date here, or a datetime object corresponding to today. So you can type date.today here with time.min. And then, as usual, you need to replace with the tz info equals to UTC, as you always want to have your dates in UTC. Okay? Then once you have that, there is another condition that you need to make, which is, what if your start date doesn't, like, the time of your start date is not set at midnight, because you want to trigger your DAG every day at midnight, right? Every weekday at midnight. But what if your start date is, for example, the 1st of January at 6 p.m.? Well, maybe in that case, you want to say, okay, if the start date is set at the 1st of January 2021 at 6 p.m., then I want to trigger my DAG the next day, because I've already missed half of the day. Okay, so in that case, you can do that again. So here you will check that by typing next start dot time is different than, for example, midnight. Okay, because this is the what you are checking here. But again, if instead your DAG should be triggered maybe at 4 p.m., then you will put 4 p.m. here. And so if it is the case, then you want to say, I'm gonna skip this day and I'm gonna trigger my DAG on the next day. So let's do that. Here you can type next underscore day equals to next start dot day dot date, sorry, plus time delta days equals to 1. Okay, that's the next day. And then the next start will be equal to a datetime object. Again, you need to define a datetime object combined with the next day and time.min. And again, you replace with tz info equals to UTC. Right? Here you're just saying, okay, if my time is not at midnight for the start date, I want to skip that day. I want to start for the next day. Okay. Okay. Now you want to verify if your DAG is scheduled during weekdays and not during weekends. So you can do that here. Here we're going to get the weekday. So you can type next start weekday equals to the next start dot weekday. Okay, so after whatever you've done here, you want to verify that the next start is not during a weekend. So you will type if next start weekday in 5 and 6. Okay, so in either on Saturday or Sunday. Then if it is the case, you want to go to the next Monday. So here you're going to type delta equals to time delta. And then again, like you did previously, 7 minus next start weekday. And you define the next start equals to next start plus time delta. Okay, that's what you are doing here. You are just saying, if my next start is either on Sunday or on Saturday, I want to move to next Monday because I don't want to trigger my DAG during weekends. Right? Now, there is one last condition that you need to check, which is, well, if your end date, if actually your start date is greater than your end date. So how can you do that? Well, first you verify if there is an end date. So for that you type if restriction.latest is not known and the next start is greater than restriction.latest. So if the start date or the next start is greater than the end date, then you want to return none. Because obviously that's not possible, right? Okay, if you set an end date to the 1st of January 2021 and you want to trigger your DAG on the 2nd of January 2021, then in that case, that shouldn't work. That's what you're doing here. And last but not least, you return the data interval. So in that case, the DAG run info object. So you type DAG run info dot interval, and you specify the start, which is equals to, well, next start, and then the end, which is equal to the next start plus the time delta object, days equals 1. Okay, I know it's a lot. I know it's a lot. That's why I wanted to start with that example. But it's, trust me, first, you will always, there are some conditions that you will always do. You will always check the start date, if the start date is none or not. You will always check the capture parameter, and you will always do that, max. Okay, either you use one or the other. You will always check if the time of the start date is correct. And then this is specific to your use case, to your scheduling interval. Then you will always do that as well. You will always check if the start date is greater than the end date, and you will always return an interval. So really, there are some conditions that you will always do, and some others, like just a little bit of code here, for example, this or this, that it is specific to that use case. Now, what should you do if actually your DAG has been already triggered in the past? Well, in that case, it's pretty simple because it's like what you've done here. So first, you're gonna get the last start. Okay, so the last time your DAG has been triggered. So you can type last automated data interval dot start. Okay, so here you are just getting the start of the previous data interval. And then you get the weekday of the previous data interval. So you type last start weekday equals to last underscore start dot weekday. Okay. Once you have that, you want to make sure that, well, actually you want to check if the previous DAG run has been triggered during a weekday. So you can type if the previous DAG run was between Monday and Friday. Okay, if so, then you just want to run your DAG. I mean, the next start should be tomorrow, right? So it is as simple as that. So you can type next start equals to, or actually delta, let's use delta here. Delta equals to time delta days equals to 1, right? But now, if your DAG, if the previous DAG run has been triggered on Friday, then in that case, you want to skip to next Monday, okay? Because you don't want to trigger your DAG during weekends. You don't want to trigger your DAG on Saturday. So here, you're going to put delta equals to, let's say, time delta. It's actually what you've done previously. So time delta days equals to 7 minus last start weekday. And then you can just specify the next start. Okay, so the next start equals to a datetime object, again, combined with the start equals, well, actually, yeah, the start equals to last start plus delta. Okay, you add your delta and the end and the time, sorry, the time will be min, so midnight, and you put the time zone info, like usual, TZ info equals to UTC. Okay, once you have that, the last step, well, actually you are done. Actually, you're done. I know it's a lot. I know it's a lot. I know it's a lot. but that's how it works, okay? That's how you can implement your timetable. Okay, the last step is once you have your timetable ready, once the next diagram info and infer data interval methods are implemented, you can go to your DAG. So for example, let's say weekday underscore DAG. Here you will import your timetable. So you will type from let's say workday, or actually from weekday underscore time, import your timetable. So here you will import after workday timetable in your DAG like that. And you will define a new argument, which is timetable equals to after workday timetable. And that's it. We're done. Okay. I know it's a lot, but trust me, if you watch the recording, and I strongly advise you to watch the recording and try by yourself. But once you have done that, you have the full control over the schedule interval of your DAG. And keep in mind here that we only define the timetable argument and not the schedule interval. Okay. Last but not least, there are some limitations. Keep in mind that the timetable will be always parsed by the scheduler. Okay, so every 30 seconds by default. So be careful with that. And why you should be careful with that? Because if you try to, let's say, do something fancy like getting your scheduling interval by requesting an API, then you might end up with some troubles, right? Because in that case, you will have more latency for your tasks because you will try to reach an API from your timetable. Don't do that. Okay, don't do that. Okay. I just would like to quickly give you some other examples, just quickly here. For example, if you want to trigger your DAG on different times, let's say maybe on Monday, you want to trigger it between 2 p.m. and 9 p.m. And then on Thursday, you want to trigger it between 4 p.m. and 10 p.m. You can do that like we did before, but this time you will just add the time. You know, before in the previous example, the time was time.min because we want to set it at midnight. But here, as you can see, we define the time, okay, according to if we are on Thursday or if we are on Monday. Okay, so that's basically what you will need to add. And if you want to deal with like training days, which is much more difficult, but one thing to note is that with the holidays, you can define them like that. And then you will just take care of your holidays, maybe as I'm doing here, but there is maybe another solution. So basically you will say, hey, if the next start is on a holiday, then I want to move to the next start and so on. Okay, so this is something that you can deal with. But as you can see, yeah, the stock market is definitely much harder to deal with. All right. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that session. I know it's a lot. I mean, timetables, pretty complex, but trust me, now you can do everything you dreamed of with your schedule intervals. Thank you, everybody. And
Mark, I think that was the best live coding session I've ever seen.
Thank you very much. It was hard.
You didn't make a single typo the entire time.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. All right, everyone. I know there's some questions here, but I think we're just about at time. So if you have questions, please feel free to shoot us an email. And we'll send out the recording for this very soon, I think in the next day or two here. So, you know, from all of us here, thank you so much for hanging out with us. And Mark, thank you again for this wonderful content.
Thank you, everybody. It was a great pleasure and hope to see you soon. Take care. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.